Good morning, Val Vista Assembly of God family. I am excited to be able to share my testimony with you today. It is a testimony of God's providence in my life. I'm a firm believer that the protective care of God has always been over the top of my life, and I'd like to tell you how. Uh, I was born to Toyson and Fred Workman, who could not have been more different people from each other. My mom was an LA girl. My dad's family was from Walsenburg, Colorado, which is basically the Hemet of Colorado. It's a very, very small town. But you know what? By God's providence, He knew that those two needed to come together. You see, my mom and dad had children before myself. We have my older brother, Josh, and we also have my older brother, Eric. And I believe that it was through the challenges with my older brother, Eric, that the journey of faith for our family even started. Eric was born physically and mentally disabled from my dad's time in Vietnam. And I remember my dad telling the story of my brother being about 3 or 4 years old after multiple surgeries. And my mom and dad decided to take him to a small church in LA. And they took him down to the altar and they asked the pastor to pray over him. And I can still hear the quiver in my dad's voice when he talks about that story, because he says it was when the pastor was praying over my brother Eric that Eric's eyes focused on my dad for the first time in his life. And it was at that point that my dad said, I'm going to make sure that I follow God and serve Him. And that started the journey of faith for our family. Growing up, it was challenging at times. Our family, was definitely loving. I loved my mom and my dad, but it was challenging. I grew up as a mixed race kid, and that was not popular all the time. Like it is now. Everybody loves the light skinned kid now with the green eyes, but I can tell you when I was growing up, it wasn't always cool, and I felt insecure a lot of times about who I was and why was I built the way I was. And I didn't understand why I looked different from other kids in my family. I just didn't understand all of that stuff. I didn't understand the difference. And so it was challenging at times. And, my parents had us in church every Sunday as a kid. We said the Lord's Prayer every night, and I remember doing all of those things. But, church, it was just a ritual to me for so many years. I did it because my parents told me to do it. And I wandered slowly away from faith. And as I did that over time, ended up in my teenage years, and I became a very angry young man. I struggled a lot, and I had anger issues, and I got into a lot of fights, and I got in trouble at school, and what all of it came down to was an identity struggle. I didn't know who to identify with or what to identify with. It even came to a point where I almost got into a fist fight with my dad in my home because of how disrespectful and angry I was. And I ran away from home and caused a lot of trouble for my mom and dad. I was lost and I was looking for something to hold on to. Well, when I was 17 years old, in the middle of all of this struggle that I was causing, my mom decided that she wanted to really know Jesus better. She wanted to know Jesus more closely. And in doing so, I watched this woman who was abused as a child, mentally and physically. She was shattered and destroyed in those ways because of what happened to her. I watched this woman over the course of 2 to 3 years become the most loving, forgiving, and empathetic person. I couldn't help but ask, what is it that made her so different? This is the same woman that kept a spatula in her purse to reach in the back seat and slap me if I got out of line. Something had changed about mom, and what it was Jesus. And I wanted what my mom had. And it was at that point, at 17 years old, that Pastor Dave Moore led me to the Lord in a youth group meeting, and things changed for me at that point. Life wasn't perfect, but I knew that I wanted what my mom had, and so I started attending church again. I started doing music. Some of you will remember that, and I was actually pretty good at the music thing. And interestingly enough, I was offered a recording contract to become a rap artist. There was good money involved in that. But the truth is, I would have had to have been gone pretty frequently. I would have been traveling. There would have been a lot of challenges. And, in God's providence, that didn't work out. Uh, but there's a reason for that. It was a little while later that my brother Eric unfortunately passed away. And, I watched how my mom and dad handled that situation. It was with God's grace, but I still worried about them. And so I stayed home locally and I went to school locally. And I, by God's providence, started to coach football. And, it was interesting because in coaching football, that's where I found my calling of working with kids in public education. Again, God's providence. That led me to start working security at a high school in Moreno Valley. And I did that at night and in the morning. Worked both shifts so that I could figure out how to go to school to become a teacher. And by God's grace, it was at that same school where I met my wife, the love of my life. And I was married to her 6 months later, and my family is still with me to this day. My wife and I, we have a beautiful family, and we had our son Eric, and then we got pregnant with our second son Andrew. And it was with our second son Andrew that for both Patty and I, we had some choices to make about our faith, and we had tough choices to make. When Patty's second pregnancy happened, the wall of her uterus was too thin, and the doctors told us that if the baby wasn't born, that either the baby would die or mom would die because the wall was going to break of the uterus. So we chose to lean into the Lord. We didn't believe in abortion, and so Andrew was born, and he did not make it. Andrew passed away, and that was one of the most difficult and challenging moments that you'll ever face as a parent, is when and if you have to lose a child. But I can tell you that through that loss, through losing my son, it was in those moments that God revealed to me the parallel of how much he loves us, that he willingly gave up his son for me and for us. And it strengthened my faith, and it strengthened my wife's faith and our family's faith, and we held together. We chose to stay faithful to Jesus, and we chose to lead through laughter and joy. And it's interesting because at that time I was a new teacher, and because of the way that I did things, I would prefer to laugh about things, and I'm not quite as serious. And I remember at the time the leadership in that school district told me to my face, they said that you're not leadership material. People won't follow you. And Patty and I prayed about that because I felt like the Lord had called me to be in leadership. Well, 1 year later, I got a phone call from a teacher that I had previously in my admin credential classes. And he told me about an opening in Hemet for an assistant principal job. And I took that job, and I have never looked back from that. And through God's providence, remember, he lines things up for us. I was able to move into a leadership position. And life was going really well for a while. I was a school principal. Things were good. We were making progress. The Lord was blessing. And then 2 years ago, my wife was hit by a drunk driver and killed unexpectedly. I did not see that coming, but who did was God. God knew what was coming. And I had God's providence enough in my life at that point to know that the only choice I had was to lean in. And 3 days later, after my wife passed away, I preached a sermon on God's faithfulness at the church. And I heard that sermon was prayed all through the hallways of the district office, that it was replayed on Facebook, and it was replayed on YouTube. And I know that things happen not for our pain, but for God's glory and God's providence. And because of God's grace, because of God's mercy, our family is still together. Our family is still serving God. Our family still believes that Jesus saves, heals, and delivers. And I know that one day I'll see my wife again. You see, church, my testimony is one of God's providence. And it's God's providence that takes the broken kid and turns him into a leader that can do mighty things. It really comes down to our personal choice. I continue to trust in Jesus, and I try to reflect that in court hearings for my wife and in every walk of my life. And my goal is to turn God's providence into a family legacy. You see, I believe that by God's grace and by his providence, that there will be workmen for generations to come who will proclaim the goodness of God, who will proclaim that. I stand on that. And I believe that our testimony is not just about us. It's about building a foundation for every generation that will come after us. Church, God is faithful, and that is my testimony. His providence is real. and his faithfulness is evident. Bless you.